towards the beginning of Friendly Fire, this memoir by Ami Ayalon that we're reading, Ami seeks to describe and explain, characterize his parents' generation, these immigrants to Palestine who built the land, built this utopian kibbutz socialist society with tremendous amount of fervor, and he wanted to understand that culture, where that came from. And so in the process, he meets with an Israeli novelist named Meir Shalev, who writes stories about these characters. The conversation drifts to the War of 1967, the Six-Day War, the war when Israel conquered large swaths of land, and the effect this had on Israel's identity. So, quote, this is Meir Shalev talking. "You remember what it was like before 1967, he continued. Israel was a humble place, a sort of Jewish Montenegro. Then came the Six-Day War. The Golani brigades fought the Syrians in the Golan Heights, where some of the conflict's deadliest battles took place. The Arabs living there had already fled, abandoning their villages. 6 weeks or so later, I ended up in Judea and Samaria. It was the first time I saw Palestinians. There were no checkpoints, and things were quiet. So I freely wandered into towns and cities. My God, I said to myself, there are so many Arabs. Tens of thousands of people just as dazed as we were. What in the hell were we going to do with them? Make them citizens?" This is Ayalon now narrating again. He went on to relate a scene he witnessed that had haunted him ever since. "I saw this old man pushing a cart with Fanta bottles and a bucket of ice," he said. "He was trying to make some money by selling to soldiers. I wasn't paying any attention until from the corner of one eye, I saw a reserve soldier, an officer, maybe 40 years old, march up to the Fanta man like he was some big security threat. 'What are you doing here?' he demanded. But the old man just stared back because he didn't understand Hebrew. So what did the officer do? He kicked the cart over. Suddenly it struck me. That was what power could do to us. Turn us all into that officer kicking a man's cart over, just because he can." Ayalon now says, "One swift kick to an officer had thrust Meir across a chasm, and there was no way back for him. The exultation of victory, felt by nearly everyone else in Israel, including myself and all my leftist kibbutz friends, had been snatched from him. Meir understood that our heroic army had handed us a poison chalice." Meir Shalev continues, "When I went home for a few days of leave several weeks later," he went on, "my father was euphoric. His dreams had come true. The land of Israel was now united. It was all ours. 'Father,' I said, 'we're going to choke on this.'" Skipping a bit, Ayalon now continues, "I'm sure I saw plenty of things like that officer and the Fanta man. I confess to Shalev. They just didn't register in my consciousness. In 1967, I went to the Wailing Wall just before the IDF bulldozed the Arab neighborhood in front of it because General Dayan, like me and almost everyone else, considered it ours. In Judea and Samaria, all I saw were rocks and trees and empty land for us to settle. Somehow I never noticed the people living there." End quote. And Ayalon references this story, this Fanta man, throughout the book because Ayalon understands, like I understand, that pretty much everyone who grew up in the Zionist world and later became a leftist has a Fanta man experience, has some realization, some revelation where they say, power corrupts. As I spoke about in the previous video on Friendly Fire, Ayalon finds himself in this very uncomfortable position where he has this knowledge, he has this information, and he feels this desperate need to get it out there. He feels like his country, his fellow countrymen have made a horrible mistake, and that the future of Israel is extremely bleak, and he's desperate to get the message out. And so at one point in the book, he goes through all the different ways, all the strategies he used to try to reach people. And so he gets approached by a documentarian named Dror Moreh, who wants to make a documentary about the work of the Shin Bet. And he agrees. He sees this as an opportunity to get his message out, but he makes it conditional. He says, "I don't want to be the only one in your documentary about the Shin Bet. You have to get everyone, all the former heads of the Shin Bet, to talk on this documentary." And this is a documentary that came out in 2012. The Hebrew title of the documentary is Shomrei Hasaf. Unfortunately, disappointingly, that was translated into English as The Gatekeepers. A much more useful translation, a better translation would be Guardians of the Threshold. In Hebrew, it has a very archaic and illustrious sounding kind of defense connotation. of like a secretive kind of honor guard, which of course is what the Shin Bet is to Israel. The Gatekeepers, which came out in 2012, is such a unique thing. It's such an amazing thing. It's absolutely incredible that 6 former heads of the Shin Bet, who undoubtedly have very different opinions about Israeli politics and all sorts of things, have undoubtedly huge criticisms of each other, for example. They all agreed to sit down and share their story, despite the Shin Bet being this most secretive organization in Israel, shrouded in mystery. For the most part, what's expressed in the documentary is an incredible amount of unanimity, an incredible amount of agreement about the problems that Israel is facing. And I want to show you just a few minutes from that documentary. And as I do that, I just want to reflect on the fact that this will not happen again. It's such a unique, unusual, unlikely occurrence for a documentary like this to exist. People who understand government and politics and history understand that positions like the Shin Bet, positions with a tremendous amount of power, tend to be led by real monsters, by people who are hungry for those kinds of positions of power. A position of power where you can sign a document and have anyone in Israel or in the territories arrested. You can torture people. You can wiretap anyone with the strike of a pen. What they engage in the Shin Bet is called blackmail. What they do is they go to Palestinians and say, oh, look, I see that your son is sick and is dying of cancer. We can get him life-saving treatment, but you have to install this bug on your friend, or you have to feed us information in return. The fact that these people are speaking out about this and speaking out about their role and their perspective on Israel's conflict with the Palestinians is such a unique, incredible moment in history. In the future, if we can learn anything from the past, the people who tend to fill these roles are monsters, J. Edgar Hoover types, people who have zero respect for the rule of law, zero respect for human rights, for liberal values. So the Gatekeepers tells basically the history of Israel through the lens of the Shin Bet, in this sort of oral history kind of way, through the narrative of Israel's security infrastructure and its war against terror. Towards the end of the documentary, these former heads of the Shin Bet, they get more philosophical and they talk more about the occupation. So this is an excerpt from basically towards the end of the documentary. The face we're looking at now is Ami Ayalon.
יש מושג שנקרא הבנליות של הרשת. כשאתה בעצם מתחיל לעשות את זה במסות, ש200, 300 אנשים מוצאים את מותם דרך האמירה הזאת של סיכון ממוקד. אז פתאום התהליכים האלה מתחילים להיות, זה כבר סרט נע. אתה פחות ופחות שואל את עצמך איפה אתה עוצר.
Okay, so that was Ami Ayalon talking about this sort of security apparatus run amok, the security apparatus that has no end. It's always looking for targets, always eating and consuming more and more and more. And he calls this, he's referencing, of course, Hannah Arendt's concept, the banality of evil, the sense in which evil doesn't happen because of sociopaths. Evil doesn't happen because of people who are fanatics. Evil happens because of people just sort of doing their job in the most regular way. It happens at the hands of people who don't feel like they're evil, who don't feel like they're doing anything wrong. And these processes, these bureaucratic processes, these security processes can spin out of control like a Dr. Frankenstein, constantly eating up targets and creating more and more terrorism in the process. As we read, as I quoted yesterday in the book from Ami Ayalon, it's a fool's errand to chase terrorism without addressing the fundamental causes that lead to terrorism in the first place.
אני אמרתי בלא מעט מקרים, טרור זו חבית שיש לה תחתית. ואתה יכול להגיע לתחתית, אתה לא צריך להגיע לאחרון המחבלים, אתה מגיע למסה קריטית, והמסה הקריטית הזו מספיקה כדי להרתיע.
So that is Avi Dichter. He was the head of the Shin Bet from 2000 to 2005. He was the successor to Ami Ayalon. Ami Ayalon was the head of the Shin Bet from 1996 to 2000. Friendly Fire talks about how Ami Ayalon butt heads with Avi Dichter later, how Ami Ayalon had very harsh criticisms of Avi Dichter's methods and operations. In the quote we just saw, Avi Dichter saying that he believed, he had this theory that there's a limit to the barrel. You just sort of scoop out of the barrel, and then you're safe. You just clean out, take out the garbage, where the garbage is like this barrel of terrorists, and you just sort of kill them, and then you're in a good spot. You get a critical mass of dead terrorists. And what this whole documentary is about, and what we're going to see as we continue, as people respond, as Ami Ayalon's about to talk, and Avi Dichter will come back to him, that is not the case. It doesn't work that way. There is no number of terrorists you just have to knock off to attain security.
אני יכול להוכיח לך שהחמאס לא נעשה מתון יותר כששייח יאסין חוסל.
Right, that's an example. One of these religious, spiritual leaders of Hamas, Israel assassinated him. Ami Ayalon says that did not make Hamas more moderate. It didn't work.
אני יכול להוכיח לך שכשהרגנו את עבאס מוסאווי וקיבלנו את נסראללה, לא ממש השתפר המצב הביטחוני במדינת ישראל.
Abbas Musawi was one of the former heads of Hezbollah, the founder of Hezbollah. So Israel, of course, assassinated him. And then after him came Nasrallah. And Ami Ayalon saying it didn't help. Our security situation by killing the head of Hezbollah didn't improve.
לכן כשאנחנו עוסקים לא בזה שקם להורגנו מיידית, אלא בזה שמטיף, אנחנו הולכים למקום שאגב, החוק הבינלאומי לא מתיר, הצדק הבסיסי מציב סימני שאלה גדולים מאוד בהיבט המוסרי, אבל אני מדבר איתך כראש שב"כ, זה לא אפקטיבי. הייתה לי עדות נפלאה, וידעתי...
This is Ami Ayalon talking about his childhood. We skip over some of that. And then he talks about the faith that he had growing up in the capacity of the leadership of Israel to steer the ship of state, and his eventual disillusionment with that. And this, like many other parts of the documentary, read as a really strong criticism of the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And at one point, I sort of cut it out because it's sort of filler, but there's like a panning down a corridor of prime ministers, and the final frame is just a picture of Benjamin Netanyahu at the end of the corridor. This is really just a criticism of the lack of leadership in Israeli politics. This tolerance, this comfort with the status quo, just let things progress, let the chaos continue to unravel. No sense of long-term thinking.
בירושלים יש בית, ובקומה השנייה יש מסדרון ארוך. ובקצה המסדרון יש דלת, ומאחורי הדלת יש אדם חכם שהוא מחליט, מקבל החלטות, הוא חושב. הוריי קראו לו הזקן. ושנים מאוחר יותר, אחרי מלחמת יום הכיפורים, הגעתי לירושלים, והגעתי לאותו בניין, והייתי בקומה השנייה. ראיתי שבקצה המסדרון אין דלת, ומאחוריה אין דלת, אין אף אחד שחושב בשבילי. אתה רואה את
This is Yaakov Perry. He was the head of the Shin Bet from 1988 to 1994, and he echoes what Ami Ayalon is saying.
את החוסר יוזמה, את ההתגלגלות שלה, לתת לדברים להתגלגל, מבלי שאתה בסופו של דבר מכניס אצבע ואומר עד כאן, לכיוון הזה או לכיוון הזה. לא מגיעים, לא מייצרים שלום
This is Avi Dichter again.
צבאיות. אלא שלום אתה מוכרח לבנות בסופו של דבר על מערכת אמון, אחרי או בלי מהלכים צבאיים, אבל בסופו של דבר אתה צריך לבנות את זה על מערכת אמון. אני טוען שכאחד שמכיר את הפלסטינים היטב, לא צריכה להיות בעיה לייצר איתם מערכת יחסי אמון, אמיתית.
This part of the documentary is the former heads of the Shin Bet pleading with the Israeli people and the Israeli government, please enter into conversation with the Palestinians. You can build a framework of trust, he's saying. You have to talk. And we'll see now This is Carmi Gilon. Carmi Gilon was the head of the Shin Bet when Rabin was assassinated, and he resigned after the Rabin assassination.
מדינת ישראל זה לוקסוס גדול מדי לא לדבר עם האויבים שלה. אז כל עוד הם מחליטים לא לדבר איתנו, אין לי ברירה. אבל כשאנחנו מחליטים לא לדבר, אני חושב שאנחנו טועים.
אתה בעד לדבר עם כל מי שאפשר?
This is Avraham Shalom. He was the head of the Shin Bet from 1981 to 1986. So he's the earliest of the former members of the Shin Bet, the oldest to speak to the camera. Avraham Shalom lived in Austria during the Nazi occupation in World War II, and his family fled to Palestine. He was involved in the capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 and bringing him to trial in Jerusalem. And he eventually he resigned from the Shin Bet in 1986 because he was involved in an extrajudicial killing of 2 Palestinian terrorists who hijacked a bus. He ordered them to be killed. There's a great line in this documentary, which is very memorable, where he says, in his way, Lo ratziti od mechablim chaim b'mishpat. And he says straight out, I didn't want to see any more living terrorists in court. And there's just this incredible juxtaposition between this man who just comes off as like the sweetest, everyone's Jewish grandfather, he's probably, just a loving, wonderful teddy bear of a human. But of course he also, does order junta style killings of terrorists. So here the narrator, Dror Moreh, the filmmaker, asked, do you support speaking to anyone? And Avraham Shalom answers.
בעד לדבר עם כל מי שאפשר?
כל מי שאפשר לדבר, וגם אם הוא עונה בחוצפה, אני בעד להמשיך. אין אלטרנטיבה.
למה?
לדבר.
כולל חמאס, ג'יהאד?
כולל כל אחד, אמרתי כל אחד, אז זה כולל גם את אחמדינג'אד, ומי ש... אני תמיד בעד להם. זה בכלל תכונה של איש מודיעין מקצועי, לדבר עם כולם. מתבררים דברים. אני רואה שאתה לא אוכל זכוכית, והוא רואה שאני לא שותה נפט. ככה זה.
אני רוצה להקריא לך קטע שנכתב על ידי פרופסור.
Again, this is the director, this is the filmmaker, Dror Moreh. He's narrating. Here he's going to quote from Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who wrote an essay called The Territories in 1968, right after the Six-Day War. And he predicted with incredible prescience the situation, the mess that Israel would find itself in if it denied the Palestinian people their own autonomy, if it tried to rule over millions of hostile Arabs.
ישעיהו ליבוביץ', שהיה מתנגד חריף לכיבוש שנה לאחר מלחמת ששת הימים, ב-68. מדינה השלטת על אוכלוסייה עוינת של 1,000,000 זרים תהיה בהכרח מדינת שין בית, עם כל מה שמתחייב מזה כהשלכות על רוח החינוך, על חופש הדיבור והמחשבה ועל המשטר הדמוקרטי. השחיתות האופיינית לכל משטר קולוניאלי תדבק גם במדינת ישראל. המנהל יצטרך לעסוק בדיכוי תנועת מרי ערבית מזה וברכישת קוויזלינגים, בוגדים ערבים מזה. מה אתה חושב על הנבואה הזאת, מהמקום בו אתה רואה את מדינת ישראל היום?
Yuval Diskin is the most recent of the former heads of the Shin Bet from 2005 to 2011. His tenure ended right before this documentary came out. And just to reiterate, Yeshayahu Leibowitz says, the future of Israel under occupation is a Shin Bet state, a police state, a state where human rights are routinely violated in the name of security, where a security apparatus is going to grow out of control. And it's gonna poison democracy from within. And so he asks Yuval Diskin, do you think Israel is a Shin Bet state? This guy just finished his tenure as the head of the Shin Bet.
אני מסכים עם כל מילה שהוא כתב פה.
אתה יכול לפרט קצת יותר?
אני חושב שאין טעם לפרט, הוא אמר כל מילה שהוא אמר פה היא בסלע.
וככה אתה חושב נראה את החברה הישראלית?
תיאור מדויק לדעתי של המציאות שהתפתחה מ-68 ועד היום. אני אולי לא הייתי מרחיק שזה הפכה להיות מדינת שין בית, אבל ללא ספק הסיטואציה שאנחנו מצויים בה מול הפלסטינים, ללא ספק יצרה מציאות שהיא די דומה למה שישעיהו ליבוביץ' כתב.
All right, now we get a long section here. I'll probably skip through it all. Maybe I'll play it on double speed. This is a reenactment of what the work of security looks like. Okay? The work of security on a day-to-day basis means soldiers making arrests. It means getting information. The Shin Bet acquires information. This guy has weapons. This guy's a terrorist. This guy's a threat. And they go in and they go into his house in the middle of the night and they arrest his family. Or no, they don't. They arrest him in front of his family. So now, after this sort of reenactment, we're going to get a discussion of what this is like in practice.
אתה דופק על דלתות באמצע הלילה, מעיר משפחה ישנה, מקורבלת. הבכי של האמא, או רגעי הפרידה של אותו חשוד שאתה לוקח מזרועות משפחתו. וזה רגעים לא קלים. אתה בסך הכל רואה את המשפחה סובלת, את הרגעים הקשים בין הורים לבין ילדים, בין ילדים לבין הורים. הם רגעים שנחרטים לך בסופו של דבר עמוק, וכשאתה פורש מהשירות, אתה הופך להיות שמאלן קצת.
I want to talk about that line. You know, these, how do you say it? These moments end up etched deep inside you. Not everyone knows this because it's fairly taboo and not a lot of people talk about this. But if you read about post-traumatic stress disorder from the Vietnam War, America's Iraq War and Afghanistan War, what you learn is that post-traumatic stress disorder is not just from being victimized by your enemies in war. A major part of post-traumatic stress disorder, it seems to me, the major part, comes from victimizing other people. The sense that soldiers in war do things which after war end up etched deep inside of them and are hard to look at. And in this case, Yaakov Perry says that, so you become a bit of a leftist, which I guess is true for some people. It's one way to deal with it. But the deeper point here is we're asking our kids, our children, to police a hostile population. And it's a horrible thing to ask your children to do. It's a horrible thing to do. And there's real consequences to that. The least of which being PTSD.
וכשאתה פורש מהשירות, אתה הופך להיות שמאלן קצת.
אנחנו הופכים חייהם של מיליונים לבלתי אפשריים, לסבל אנושי אחד מתמשך. ואנחנו משאירים את ההחלטה מה מידתי ולא מידתי בידי חייל שהוא כמה חודשים בצבא. שנה לפני כן, במקרה הטוב, הוא גמר בית ספר תיכון. הוא עומד שם מול אב עם תינוקת וצריך להחליט אם הוא כן מחפש, לא מחפש, הוא כן יעבור, לא יעבור. זה הורס אותי, שתדע לך.
העתיד אפור, שחור עתיד. אבל מה הוא גורם? הוא גורם לשינוי באופי של האוכלוסייה. כי אתה מכניס לא את כולם, אבל את רובם של הצעירים שלנו והצעירות שלנו לצבא. הם רואים שם דבר והיפוכו, הם רואים מצד אחד שזה רוצה להיות צבא עממי, והחותר להיות כמו הנחל, ומצד שני צבא כיבוש אכזרי שדומה לגרמנים במלחמת העולם השנייה. דומה. לא זה... אני לא מדבר על ההתנהגות שלהם כלפי היהודים, זה דבר יוצא דופן עם אספקטים משלו. אני מדבר על איך שהם התנהגו לפולנים, לבלגים ולהולנדים וכל אלה, לצ'כים. זו תכונה מאוד מאוד שלילית שרכשנו לעצמנו להיות, אני מפחד להגיד את המילים האלה, אז אני לא אגיד אותן. שהפכנו להיות אכזריים גם כלפי עצמנו, אבל בעיקר כלפי האוכלוסייה הנשלטת, בתירוץ של מלחמה בטרור.
So that's it. Those are that's the 10 minutes that I wanted to share. I want to end on a quote that haunts me. There's a book that had a very big impact on my thinking. It's titled "They Thought They Were Free: The Germans from 1933 to 1945." It's just Milton Mayer, a journalist, going to Germany after World War II and getting to know regular Nazis and just trying to understand, where were you? What were you doing when the Nazis took power? Why did you support the Nazi regime? Milton Mayer himself was Jewish, and he just wanted to understand, how could people be so evil? How could they tolerate so much evil? And one of the conversations, he has so many very telling, powerful conversations about the social factors, the psychological factors that led to Nazism, that led to regular people supporting Nazis. This is one excerpt of dialogue from the book. He's talking to one of these regular Nazis. He says, quote, Herr Professor, we are told that not a sparrow falls without God's care. I am not being light when I say this, that not a person fell ill or in need, lost his job or his house without the party's caring. The party in this case is the Nazi party. No organization had ever done this before in Germany, maybe nowhere else. Believe me, such an organization is irresistible to men. No one in Germany was alone in his troubles. And then Milton Mayer interjects, except, I said, inferior races and opponents of the regime. The man responds, of course, he said, that is understood. But they were few. They were outside society, over the fence, and nobody thought about them. And Milton Mayer, the author, continues, but these two were sparrows. Yes, he said. Could these, I said, have been the least of them of whom Jesus spoke? Herr Professor, we didn't see it that way. We were wrong, we were sinful, but we didn't see it that way. We saw the least of them among our own people, everywhere, among ordinary people who obeyed the laws and were not Jews or gypsies and so on. Among ordinary people, Aryans, they were the least of them too. Millions, 6 million unemployed at the beginning. These least, not all who were least, but most of them had somewhere to turn at last. End quote. And that's the defense. That's a defense that made Nazism acceptable to people, that made it work. There was love. There was love for your own people, love for your own race, and an awareness of your own problems, and a blindness, a blind spot to the people over the fence, the people that stood outside of society. We were the ordinary people who obeyed the laws, he says, there was no empathy. There was no putting yourself in their shoes. And that exchange haunts me to this day. And I think that in life, you can't know that you're in the right. You can't know that you're on the right side of history. You can't know that your political, moral perspective is correct if you haven't done the work of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. The work, the hard work, the unpleasant work of imagining, of reading, the primary texts, of listening to the testimonies, the primary experiences of people on the other side of the fence. Those people that are so easy to ignore,